Hello everyone, and welcome to this course on Global Pandemics 101 offered by the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. My name is Jorge Viñuales. I'm a professor at the University of Cambridge, and the purpose of this discussion is really to introduce some aspects of the interconnections between the environment and global health, including an issue that is increasingly discussed in global negotiations, which is OneHealth, the OneHealth approach. So start with some facts. I will be basing my facts on a report of the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a long name for what most people call IPBES. And the report that I'm referring to is a report of late 2020, in which the IPBES and a number of other organizations essentially mentioned that just as a matter of re-emphasizing the importance of the nexus, the majority, 70% of emerging diseases such as Ebola, Zika, or Nipah encephalitis, and almost all known pandemics, influenza, HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19, are zoonotic diseases or zoonoses. That means that they are caused by a pathogen that jumps from an animal host into humans. The importance is also reminded or re-emphasized by the fact that there are an estimated 1.7 million currently undiscovered viruses that exist in mammal and avian hosts, and many of them, essentially between 600,000 and 800,000, have the ability to infect humans, and that some of the animal reservoirs that contain pathogens with pandemic potential are, of course, mammals, but also some birds and livestock. So I guess that this very brief recollection of facts is just to put in perspective the fact that this is a very important nexus for health, and that it has to be governed international. Now, if one looks at how it is governed international, then, which is the second part of my presentation, then the question is a bit more complex. And in order to make it simpler, one must distinguish two main concepts. One is the concept of prevention, at least how it is understood in environmental circles and in many other circles. And a different concept is the concept of containment. Some people also speak about response. The IHRs, the International Health Regulations, in the revised version of 2005, they are essentially an instrument of containment. So they don't focus on preventing the spillover of a pathogen from an animal to a human host. They don't focus on preventing outbreaks of infectious disease. They only focus on managing or containing the spread of infectious disease international. That's an important shortcoming of the IHRs, and that makes a clear distinction between what one could call real prevention, genuine prevention, or deep prevention. Deep prevention is about actually preventing the outbreaks and the spillover of pathogens from humans to animals. There are different ways of deep prevention, but something to keep in mind is that many of the drivers of this emergence or re-emergence of infectious disease are also major environmental degradation phenomena. Just to give you a couple of examples, land use change is directly linked with the increased probability of infectious disease emergence. Wildlife trade, both legal and illegal, is directly linked with the spillover sometimes of infectious disease. There has been a lot of discussion about pangolins and the role in the emergence of the COVID-19 disease. Climate change, of course, and desertification are very important because they have many different effects, including the redistribution, the geographical redistribution of disease vectors around the world to new places where there is a much higher potential for an outbreak. So you see that this nexus is very important. Now, if one looks at this nexus from the prevention perspective, really the prevention of spillover and outbreaks, or deep prevention, one can see that at the legal level, the macro drivers of potential pandemics, climate change, land use change, wildlife traffic, etc., these macro drivers are governed by a range of important treaties. I will mention, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, the Climate Change Convention, the UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, then a regional instrument, the Protocol on Water and Health, which is a very important instrument for the connection with water, and a number of others. What you see really is that the macro drivers, or in other words, what could be called upstream deep prevention, is fairly governed out there. And what you just need in that realm is more specificity and more implementation. On the other hand, if instead of looking at drivers, one looks at events, and by events I mean the spillover itself, which is an event, or, for example, the mutation, the genetic mutation that gives rise to a new strand of a pathogen that may be, for example, resistant to antibiotics, or you look at the outbreaks themselves, the outbreak events, which is an outbreak is a sudden increase in the number of infected people in a given area as compared to a certain baseline. So if you look at those events, what is very curious is that they are almost not regulated in the global health architecture. Even the IHRs are only about detecting and notifying outbreaks, but they do not even attempt to prevent the outbreak by requiring states to adopt a range of measures to improve the health of their populations. So this other form of deep prevention, which we call not upstream but midstream deep prevention, is a big blind spot in the legal architecture. Now, moving to my third part, or the third part of my presentation, what weaknesses were exposed by COVID-19? Many weaknesses. Of course, the global health architecture has been constantly put to test over the years, and each time that there has been an epidemic or a pandemic, there have been attempts at reforming that architecture or improving the system. The COVID-19 pandemic has been particularly difficult, and it has unveiled or re-emphasized a number of problems. I will just mention four of them, but there are many. One of them is a focus of the international health regulations just on containment. So very little, almost nothing about real, genuine prevention. That's something that could be remedied perhaps in the next 2 years through the negotiation of a global pandemic instrument. Another important aspect is the overwhelming focus on human health. Now, this has been flagged as a major problem in discussions of what is increasingly referred to as the OneHealth approach. Now, OneHealth that entered the policy discourse in the early 2000s, right after the problems that arose from the SARS and the H5N1 epidemics. The development of the concept or the pathway that followed the concept in global discourse required the increasing interaction between different organizations, particularly 4 organizations that have really increased their collaboration. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the WHO, the World Health Organization, the OIE, which is better known in its French name, which is the Organisation Internationale pour les Epizooties, and of course UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. These 4 organizations, they set up a high-level panel that came up in late 2021 with an attempt at defining this approach. The definition that the high-level panel provided is an integrated unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animal, and ecosystems. Now, it's important to keep in mind that One Health does not only mean, or cannot only mean, just integrating animal, human, and environmental health, it also means that there is no such thing as purely local or national health as opposed to global health. Things that happen very far away can affect very quickly the situation of a country, despite the fact that a country may try to insulate itself through trade measures and traffic measures. It's very important to keep in mind that this is a global problem and it has to be handled as a global problem. We are learning to do that slowly because OneHealth has an Achilles heel, which is the fact that, yes, we increasingly agree on the OneHealth approach, but we still lack any clear strategy to make it actionable, to make it operational. There have been proposals, I will refer to them briefly later, but we're still not yet there. Third main problem that the COVID-19 pandemic unveiled, or actually in this case re-emphasized, is the issue of implementation. The IHRs were largely, let's put it in mild terms, were poorly implemented. Sometimes they were utterly ignored. And this is very, very important and very important to flag, because some countries such as South Africa that try to abide by the IHRs and notify very early on the emergence of a new disease strand, a new virus strand, well, they were penalized for following actually the IHR system. So we see that the IHRs have both an implementation deficit, but also a design problem, not just because they focus only on containment, but because even if they are fully implemented, they have side effects that are adverse for the countries that abide by them. Fourth and final big issue that was unveiled by the pandemic is an issue of equity fault lines. I think that the most important or most visible aspect of these equity fault lines can be pinned down to access to vaccines. There was a fight for vaccines. Some rich countries actually captured most of the early vaccine production. And that was short-sighted because, as I was saying earlier, OneHealth cannot only mean the integration of environmental, human and animal health, but it also needs to take into account that there is no real health or no protection against a pandemic when we're not looking at the global situation as opposed to just the local political situation. Of course, there are political reasons why countries prefer to prioritize their own populations, but it's short-sighted. I could mention many different issues such as disinformation, the anti-vaccine campaigns, a range of things that are also affect environmental discussions such as climate change. But I will stop there because I think it's time to really put a bit more emphasis on what can be done. And this is my fourth and last element for today. And again, much has been proposed. So I will simply flag three main processes that I think have a lot of potential. The first is the launch of an intergovernmental body, INB, by a special session of the World Health Assembly in December of 2021, which is supposed to draft by 2024 a global pandemic instrument. The legal nature of this instrument is still debated. It could be a convention, it could be, as the IHRs, it could be regulations adopted by the Assembly, it could be something else, an agreement. But it is under negotiation, and the issue of OneHealth has been prominently discussed. There is a draft of a few days ago that was circulated or was made available by the Secretariat, and we see that OneHealth appears there in different ways, not necessarily the ways that one would expect OneHealth to feature in. There is a separate section on OneHealth that would make little sense because it's an approach that is cross-cutting, transversal, so it cannot be a separate section in a treaty. But I think that the paper that has been circulated is only there to put some proposals, to give some order, some initial systematic order to the proposal that have been put forward by states. A second important development, which gained momentum in May of this year, of 2022, is the amendment of the international health regulations. So there has been a call for states to submit proposals for amendment. Some states, such as the United States, for example, have already submitted some important amendment proposals, but there is a process right now for other member states to submit proposals by September of this year, of 2022, which will then feed into a discussion within the WHO, which will be considered probably 2023 is a bit early, but probably in 2024. So we are now in a process of revising the IHRs yet another time since the 2005 revision. And then the third aspect that I should mention here really looks at this integration from the perspective of environmental policy. The fifth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA 5.2, that met in February 2022, came up with two resolutions, but there is particularly one, a very important resolution that strengthened, that tried to add momentum to the mainstreaming of the One Health approach, particularly from the perspective of preventing deep prevention of zoonotic disease outbreaks and pandemics. My own suggestion, if I may be allowed to give just one single suggestion in this process, is that at this stage, noise, too many proposals, too much out there, is becoming unhelpful. I think we should focus very, very specifically and have a very clear focus. If we really want to give One Health as an approach to the nexus between environment and health a clear traction in international negotiations, one must focus on deep prevention. Deep prevention understood as actually preventing the spillover or the outbreaks themselves. Now, because deep prevention of outbreaks and spillovers is already well covered at the level of macro drivers, essentially land use change, climate change, etc., I think that the main focus of deep prevention efforts should be on midstream deep prevention, which is trying to address the events such as spillovers, such as genetic mutation of pathogens, such as outbreaks themselves. And as I mentioned earlier today, I think there is a big hole in the global governance of health in that aspect, which we should be filling. Thank you very much for your attention.